He thought the handcuffs would tell the room who belonged and who did not. In a courthouse just outside Charleston, where the air always smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and burned coffee, Officer Daniel Reeves snapped a pair of cuffs around Marcus Avery's wrists, as if he were closing a case instead of opening a wound. The metal click was not loud, but in that crowded courtroom it seemed to echo off every wooden bench and polished rail. Conversations died. Pens stopped moving. Even the bailiff near the back lifted his head. Marcus did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there in a charcoal suit, broad-shouldered and still, his jaw tight but controlled, while Reeves kept one hand on his arm like he needed the whole room to see that he was in charge. "You don't just walk in here and act like you own the place," Reeves said, loud enough for the judge's clerk, the attorneys, and the waiting families to hear. The words landed with the kind of practiced contempt that did not begin in that room and would not end there. Marcus lowered his eyes for half a second, not in submission, but in discipline. Anyone watching closely would have seen it in the way he breathed once, slow and measured, as if he were forcing himself to step back from a line only he could see. 40 minutes earlier, he had parked his truck 3 blocks away and walked the rest under a gray South Carolina sky, carrying a thin folder tucked under his arm. Inside were service records, character letters, and a statement he had rewritten twice the night before because he wanted every word to matter. He was not there for himself. He was there for his younger cousin, Elijah Brooks, a 22-year-old warehouse worker facing charges after a traffic stop had turned into the kind of misunderstanding that always seemed to grow sharper around black men. Marcus had promised Elijah's mother he would come. He had promised he would speak calmly, clearly, and only when asked. That was the kind of promise Marcus kept. He had spent most of his adult life keeping promises under pressure. By the time he entered the courthouse, he had already noticed the usual things: the guard at the front door checking his ID a second time after waving others through, the quick glance at his hands, the brief pause after hearing his name. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to on paper. Just the quiet friction of being treated like a question before you were ever allowed to become a person. Marcus had lived with that friction long enough to recognize it on contact. Still, he stayed polite. Still, he followed every instruction. Still, when Reeves stopped him outside Department B and asked why he was there, Marcus answered with the same, even tone he had used from the start. "I'm here as a character witness," he said. But some men heard calm and mistook it for defiance. Some men saw dignity and took it as a challenge. Reeves asked for identification again. Marcus gave it. Reeves studied it too long, then looked up with narrowed eyes, as though the problem was not the document in his hand but the man standing in front of him wearing it. Around them, people pretended not to stare. A mother in the second row pulled her daughter a little closer. A public defender shifted uncomfortably, then looked away. Judge Helen Mercer had not yet taken the bench, and in that small gap before order officially began, the room belonged to whatever kind of power was bold enough to fill it. Reeves stepped closer. Marcus remained still. "Officer," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, "you're making a mistake." And for the first time that morning, the entire courtroom felt the ground begin to move beneath the story they thought they were watching. Reeves held Marcus in place for another few seconds, not because Marcus had done anything threatening, but because some men needed an audience more than they needed a reason. The officer's face was set in that hard expression people wore when they wanted procedure to sound like permission. "Character witness," he repeated, glancing at the identification card in his hand as if the words themselves offended him. "That is convenient." Marcus said nothing at first. He had learned long ago that silence could be stronger than explanation, especially when the other person was not listening to understand, but listening to confirm what they had already decided. Across the room, Elijah Brooks sat frozen beside his public defender, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed on Marcus with the helpless look of someone watching his last solid piece of support being stripped away in front of him. Elijah was young, but not so young that he had not seen this kind of moment before. He knew what it meant when a black man stayed calm and was treated like the danger anyway. The room carried that knowledge too, even if no one dared name it out loud. A woman in the gallery lowered her gaze to her lap. An older man near the aisle rubbed the brim of his cap between both hands. The clerk kept shuffling papers that no longer needed shuffling, as though the sound might fill the moral emptiness opening in the room. Then Judge Helen Mercer entered through the side door, black robe moving in a clean sweep, her expression already sharpened by the delay she had clearly sensed before taking the bench. She looked first at the docket, then at Elijah, then at Marcus standing in cuffs beside Officer Reeves. Her eyes narrowed by a fraction. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked. Reeves straightened immediately, almost relieved to have authority aimed somewhere he could answer to. He cleared his throat and said Marcus had been uncooperative near the entrance to the courtroom, that he had concerns about identification, that he was maintaining order. It was the kind of statement that sounded official until one listened closely enough to hear how little substance it carried. Judge Mercer turned to Marcus. "Sir, what is your name?" "Marcus Avery, Your Honor," he said, calm as ever. "And why are you here today?" "I am here to give a character statement on behalf of my cousin, Elijah Brooks." The judge studied him for a moment, then asked the clerk for the witness list. Her finger moved down the page once, then stopped. Marcus was on it. Not as a surprise witness. Not as an interruption. He had been cleared the day before. That small fact changed the temperature of the room, though not all at once. Reeves shifted his stance. The hand that had looked so confident on Marcus's arm now seemed less certain, less sure of what story it was helping tell. "Officer Reeves," Judge Mercer said, her voice cool and exact, "did you review today's witness list before detaining this man?" Reeves hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. "I was acting out of caution, Your Honor." Caution. The word hung in the air like a curtain people had seen used too many times. Marcus finally lifted his head and looked toward the bench, not with anger, but with a steadiness that made the room feel smaller around him. Imagine standing there, dressed for court, invited by the system itself, and still being asked to prove you deserve to breathe inside it. Imagine doing everything right and finding that right was not always enough. Judge Mercer looked from Marcus to the folder that had fallen near the rail during the commotion. One of the pages had slipped free. From where she sat, she could see the top line clearly enough to read the seal. United States Navy. She did not react dramatically. She did not need to. Real authority rarely announced itself with noise. "Remove the handcuffs," she said. And for the first time since that cold metal had closed around his wrists, Officer Daniel Reeves looked less like a man in control and more like a man who was beginning to understand that he had made the kind of mistake that does not fade when the room clears out. The room did not move right away. That was the strange thing about moments when power shifted. It did not happen like thunder. It happened like a held breath finally being noticed. Officer Reeves looked at Judge Mercer as if he expected her to soften the order, to give him some procedural escape route, some sentence that would let him save face in front of the attorneys, the clerk, the families, and the young man at the defense table whose future had already been hanging by a thread. But Judge Mercer did not repeat herself. She simply held his gaze with the kind of stillness that made excuses sound childish before they were even spoken. Reeves reached for the cuffs with hands that now seemed heavier than they had a minute earlier. When the metal released, Marcus lowered his wrists slowly and stepped back half a pace, rubbing one thumb across the feint. Pressure marks without drama, without complaint, as if he refused to let that moment define his posture. He bent, picked up the folder that had slipped near the rail, and straightened the papers inside with careful precision. That simple act, done in silence, carried more dignity than anything anyone else in the courtroom had offered him. Elijah watched from the defense table, his eyes glassy with a mix of relief and shame, the kind of shame that came when someone you loved had to be humiliated just for standing beside you. Marcus caught his cousin's look and gave the smallest nod, steady and deliberate, a message without words. Stay grounded. Do not let this room decide your worth. Judge Mercer asked the clerk to approach the bench. She reviewed the witness list again, then requested the security log from the entrance and the sign-in sheet from the front desk. Every page confirmed the same thing. Marcus Avery had followed procedure. He had checked in. He had been approved. He had been where he was supposed to be from the moment he entered the building. The only thing out of place had been the assumption placed on him. Reeves shifted his weight and tried once more to retreat behind official language, saying he had reacted to behavior he considered suspicious, saying courthouse security required vigilance, saying it was better to be safe than sorry. But even he seemed to hear how thin those words sounded now. Better to be safe than sorry for whom? Vigilance against what? Suspicious because of what? Those were the questions no one asked directly, because everyone in that courtroom already knew the answers were sitting there in plain view, written not on paper, but across years of learned fear and unlearned prejudice. Judge Mercer turned her attention to Marcus again. "Mr. Avery," she said, her tone more measured now. "Do you wish to make a statement regarding what happened?" Marcus stood with both hands resting lightly on the folder in front of him. For a moment, it seemed the entire courtroom leaned inward. He could have listed every insult carried in the officer's tone, every quiet signal the room had sent him since he walked through the front doors. He could have made the humiliation public in sharper detail than anyone there was prepared to hear. Instead, he spoke with the same restraint that had unsettled Reeves from the beginning. "Your Honor," he said, "I came here to speak for my cousin. I followed every instruction I was given. I showed identification. I stayed respectful. But respect only works if it goes both ways." The words were not loud, yet they landed harder than any raised voice could have. A silence rolled through the courtroom, not empty this time, but reflective. Even the prosecutor looked down at his notes as though the pages might offer somewhere to hide. Judge Mercer folded her hands. "What branch of service did you serve in, Mr. Avery?" Marcus answered without emphasis. "United States Navy, Your Honor." "And your role?" There was a brief pause. Not because Marcus was hesitant, but because some truths changed a room the moment they were spoken. Special warfare, naval special operations, precision weapons, and reconnaissance. A murmur moved across the gallery before dying just as fast. Marcus did not dress the answer up. He did not offer medals, deployments, or titles. He let the facts stand on their own, the way men like him often did. Judge Mercer gave a small nod, then looked toward the clerk. "Contact the number on his supporting documents," she said. "Now." The clerk hurried to comply, and for the next few minutes the courtroom sat suspended between what had happened and what was about to be confirmed. Marcus remained still. Reeves remained standing. And somewhere deep beneath the polished wood, the old machinery of assumption had begun to grind against something it could not easily move. The waiting was not long, but in that courtroom it stretched like a mile. The clerk stood near the bench with the phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a careful, lowered voice while everyone else tried to pretend they were not listening. Judge Mercer reviewed the file in front of her with controlled focus, turning each page slowly, pausing at the service record, the witness clearance form, the signed entry log, and the character statement Marcus had prepared for Elijah. Every document told the same simple story. He had entered through the front security checkpoint at 8:13 that morning. He had presented identification. He had been approved. He had been instructed to wait outside Department B until called. There was no gap in the record, no unexplained movement, no broken chain of procedure. The problem was not what Marcus had done. The problem was what Officer Reeves had assumed. Marcus remained standing beside the rail, shoulders square, expression calm, though anyone who understood men like him could see the effort beneath that stillness. He was not detached. He was disciplined. There was a difference. The discipline had been built over years most people in that room could not imagine, in places where one impatient decision could cost more than reputation. But this was not a battlefield overseas. This was a county courthouse in South Carolina, and somehow that fact made the moment feel smaller and sadder at the same time. Elijah sat motionless, hands locked together so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. His public defender leaned toward him once, whispering something reassuring, but Elijah barely nodded. He could not stop staring at Marcus, and Marcus knew why. Young men learned early that dignity could be taken from them in public before they ever learned how to protect it. That was why Marcus had come. Not just to testify about Elijah's character, but to stand in the room as proof that a black man could carry himself with order, service, and honor and still be forced to prove he belonged. The clerk finally lowered the phone and approached the bench with a face that had changed in the course of a single call. She did not speak loudly, yet every word reached the silence. The office listed on the supporting documents had confirmed Marcus Avery's service record. More than that, the contact had asked for the name of the courthouse, the case number, and the identity of the officer involved in the detention. Judge Mercer's expression hardened, not theatrically, but in the way of someone beginning to see the size of a failure inside her own courtroom. "Officer Reeves," she said, "you detained a cleared witness with verified military credentials and no sign of noncompliance. Is there anything in the record that justifies your decision? Reeves opened his mouth, then closed it again. The confidence was gone now. All that remained was the brittle shell of someone who had counted on the room sharing his instincts and was only now realizing that instincts were not evidence. Your Honor, I thought it was best to act quickly. Judge Mercer did not blink. Quickly is not the same as correctly. The line settled over the courtroom with the weight of something larger than a reprimand. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. One of the older attorneys removed his glasses and looked down, as though the scene had finally become too plain to watch comfortably. Marcus did not look at Reeves. He kept his eyes on the bench, one hand resting lightly on the folder that contained the life he had built after years of sacrifice and silence. Then the courtroom doors opened again, not with chaos, not with spectacle, but with the quiet certainty of official presence. A uniformed aide stepped inside first, followed by a tall man in a dark service dress uniform marked by silver stars and the kind of authority that did not need introduction. Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale entered the room with measured steps, his face grave, his posture exact. The moment people recognized who he was, the silence changed shape. It was no longer uncertainty. It was recognition. And for the first time that morning, Officer Daniel Reeves looked at Marcus Avery not as a stranger to be controlled, but as a man connected to a truth far bigger than his own narrow judgment had allowed him to see. Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale did not rush, and that was what made his presence so commanding. He crossed the courtroom floor with the measured pace of a man who had spent his life understanding the difference between urgency and control. The silver stars on his shoulders caught the pale overhead light, and for a moment the room seemed to forget how to breathe. Judge Mercer rose slightly from the bench in acknowledgement, her face composed but unmistakably alert. The clerk stepped back. Even the attorneys, people trained to act unimpressed by power, could not hide the shift. In their posture, Hale stopped a few feet from Marcus first, not from the bench, not from the officer, but from the man who had been made to stand there in silence while others decided what he must be. The Admiral looked directly at him, and what passed across his face was not surprise. It was disappointment, deep and personal, the kind that comes when an institution fails someone who has already given it more than most ever will. Chief Avery, he said, his voice low and clear, I am sorry. No one in the room had expected those words to come first. Not a command, not a demand, not a defense of rank. An apology. It landed in the courtroom with more force than anger would have. Marcus held the Admiral's gaze and gave a single restrained nod, but he did not speak. He did not rescue the room from its discomfort. He let the apology sit there where everyone had to feel it. Rear Admiral Hale then turned toward Judge Mercer. Your Honor, thank you for allowing me to enter on short notice. I was informed that Chief Marcus Avery, retired from Naval Special Warfare and currently serving as a training consultant under federal contract, was detained while appearing as a cleared witness in this court. He paused only long enough for the meaning of every word to settle. I am not here to suggest that military service places any citizen above the law. I am here because no citizen should be lowered beneath it. The sentence moved through the courtroom like a current. Marcus remained still, but something changed in Elijah's face at the defense table. The young man sat a little straighter now, not because the morning had become easier, but because someone had finally said aloud what the room had been avoiding from the start. Respect was not supposed to be a reward for impressive credentials. It was supposed to be the baseline. Judge Mercer inclined her head. Admiral, the court understands. Hale turned then, slowly, toward Officer Reeves. The officer stood rigid, every trace of earlier certainty drained away. He looked less like a guardian of order and more like a man trapped inside the consequences of his own unchecked assumptions. Hale did not raise his voice. Men in his position rarely needed to. Officer, he said, do you understand what happened here today? Reeves swallowed before answering. Yes, sir. But the Admiral's expression did not change. No, he said, not cruelly, but with exacting honesty. I do not believe you do. If this man had not carried the record he carries, if this court had not paused long enough to verify him, you would have sent a message to every person in this room that procedure depends on perception and dignity depends on appearance. That is not security. That is failure. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. Marcus looked down briefly at the folder in his hands, at the pages that had been enough to prove his service but had not been enough to protect his humanity. Imagine serving your country in silence, only to be reminded back home that some people will still see your skin before they see your name. Imagine how exhausting it must be to remain calm in a world that keeps asking you to earn what should already be yours. Rear Admiral Hale turned back to Marcus. Chief Avery, on behalf of the uniform I wear, I apologize that you were treated this way while standing in support of your family. The words were formal, but the emotion behind them was unmistakably human. Marcus finally spoke, his voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. I appreciate that, Admiral. Then he lifted his eyes toward the bench, and the whole courtroom seemed to lean toward what he would say next. Marcus let the silence settle before he spoke again, and in that pause the courtroom seemed to hear itself for the first time all morning. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A page turned somewhere near the prosecution table. Outside the tall windows, the sky had gone the flat, pale gray of a day that could not decide whether it wanted rain. Inside, every eye stayed on him. Not because he was the loudest person in the room, but because he was not. Men who had spent years around authority knew that composure like his did not come from comfort. It came from training, from burden, from having learned the hard way that self-control was often the only thing no one could take from you. Marcus rested one hand on the folder and faced Judge Mercer with the same measured calm he had carried from the moment he walked into the building. Your Honor, he said, I did not come here asking for special treatment. I came here expecting ordinary fairness. The words were simple, but they moved through the courtroom with a quiet force that made people lower their eyes. I served long enough to know that titles matter less than standards. Uniforms matter less than conduct. And if respect only shows up when a record gets read or a rank gets recognized, then it is not respect. It is hesitation. Judge Mercer listened without interruption. So did Rear Admiral Hale. Even Officer Reeves, still standing stiffly near the rail, no longer looked defensive. He looked exposed in a way procedure could not cover. Marcus turned slightly, not enough to face the gallery fully, but enough for his voice to reach every bench. My cousin is sitting at that table today hoping this court will see him clearly. A lot of people come into rooms like this hoping for the same thing. Not praise, not mercy, just clarity, just a fair look before judgment enters the room. Elijah swallowed hard at the defense table, his expression tightening as if each word had found a place in him he had been trying to keep closed. Marcus did not dramatize his point. He did not need to. He stood there with the ease of a man who had spent years being underestimated before speaking. What happened to me this morning can be corrected, he continued. The record can reflect it. The court can address it. But there are people this happens to who do not have supporting documents in a folder, who do not get a phone call returned, who do not have someone with stars on his shoulders willing to walk through that door. Their dignity matters the same. That was the moment the room changed again. Not toward outrage this time, but toward recognition. Real recognition. The kind that strips away the comfort of pretending a problem only becomes serious when it happens to someone decorated, accomplished, or connected. Judge Mercer leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the bench. Mr. Avery, she said, her voice lower now, less procedural and more human. This court acknowledges that truth. Marcus gave a small nod, then looked toward Officer Reeves for the first time since the Admiral had entered. He did not glare. He did not perform forgiveness for the benefit of the room. He simply looked at him with a steadiness that was harder to bear than anger. Officer, he said, I do not need you to fear me. I need you to see people before you decide what they are. Reeves opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Whatever answer he might have prepared had no place left to stand. Rear Admiral Hale remained motionless, though there was a flicker of approval in his expression, not because Marcus had won the room, but because he had refused to become small inside it. Judge Mercer turned to the clerk and instructed that the incident be entered into the record in full, along with a request for immediate review of courthouse security conduct and witness handling procedures. The scratch of the clerk's pen sounded louder now, as if accountability itself had a texture. And as Marcus finally took his seat near the witness stand, the room understood something it had failed to understand when he first arrived. The strongest man there had not been the one with authority to restrain. It had been the one with every reason to break, and who still chose discipline instead. When Marcus sat down near the witness stand, the courtroom did not return to normal. It could not. Something too plain had been exposed, and once a room sees itself clearly, even for a moment, the old rhythm becomes harder to recover. Judge Mercer adjusted the case file in front of her and called the hearing back to order, but her voice carried a different weight now, less automatic, more deliberate, as if she understood that every word from that bench would be measured against what had just happened. Elijah Brooks looked smaller than he had when the morning began, but he also looked steadier. There was pain in his face, yes, and embarrassment too, but beneath it sat something harder to name. Recognition, maybe. The realization that he had not imagined the unfairness pressing on him, that someone he trusted had seen it, stood through it, and named it without turning bitter. His public defender rose and resumed her place, though even she took a breath before speaking, as if the case had shifted from a routine hearing into something morally heavier. Judge Mercer nodded for the defense to proceed. Elijah's attorney explained again that the charge against him had grown out of a traffic stop that escalated when an officer claimed he had failed to comply quickly enough with verbal instructions. There had been no weapon, no threat, no property damage, no attempt to flee. Only confusion, fear, and a situation interpreted in the harshest possible light. The prosecutor argued that the arresting officer had acted within his discretion, but even he sounded less certain now, because the room had just watched where unchecked discretion could lead when filtered through assumption instead of fact. Then Judge Mercer called Marcus Avery to speak. He rose with the same calm he had carried all day, stepped to the witness position, and placed one hand lightly on the rail, as if grounding himself not in the court's authority, but in his own. He did not speak quickly. He never had. The first thing he said about Elijah was not that he was innocent, though Marcus believed he was. The first thing he said was that Elijah worked 6 days a week, helped his mother with rent, drove his younger sister to classes at the community college, and still showed up every Sunday to help his grandfather carry groceries into the house. He spoke in specifics, because real character lived in specifics. He said Elijah could be impatient sometimes, proud sometimes, too quick to shut down when he felt disrespected, but never cruel, never reckless, never the kind of young man who deserved to be reduced to a report written in 5 hurried minutes by someone who had already decided what he was. The room listened differently now, not just because Marcus had a military record, not even because an admiral stood a few feet behind him. They listened because Marcus spoke about Elijah the way all people deserve to be spoken about when their future is being weighed, with context, with honesty, with dignity. He is still learning, Marcus said, his voice low and steady. But learning does not make a person dangerous. Being young does not make a person guilty. And being afraid in the wrong moment should not become a life sentence in the hands of a system that is supposed to know the difference. Elijah looked down then, pressing his lips together as if fighting back the pressure rising in his chest. Across the aisle, even the prosecutor seemed unwilling to interrupt. Rear Admiral Hale remained still near the back, his presence no longer the center of the story, but a witness to something more important. This was not about military prestige anymore. It was about who got to be seen as fully human before judgment hardened around them. Judge Mercer listened to every word, then reviewed the file once more, her fingers resting on the pages longer than before. Outside, a light rain had finally begun, tapping softly against the windows in a rhythm that made the room feel smaller, quieter, closer to truth. And when Marcus finished speaking and stepped back from the rail, it was clear that the most powerful testimony given that morning had not been about rank or service or reputation. It had been about what kind of country people claimed to believe in, and whether that belief still meant anything when an ordinary black man stood in front of the law asking not to be feared, not to be favored, but simply to be seen. Judge Mercer did not issue her ruling immediately. Instead, she sat in stillness for several long seconds, one hand resting on the file, the other folded over it, as if she understood that what came next would be heard far beyond Elijah Brooks and the charge written beside his name. The rain outside deepened, soft at first, then steadier, tracing thin silver lines down the courthouse windows. No one in the room seemed eager to move. Even the usual restlessness that followed testimony had faded. The benches were quiet. The clerk's pen was still. Officer Reeves remained near the side rail, not dismissed, not addressed again yet. but present in the uncomfortable way a mistake remains present long after the moment that created it has passed. Judge Mercer finally looked up. "This court is not here to reward assumptions," she said, her voice controlled and firm. "It is here to examine conduct, context, and evidence." She turned first to the prosecutor and asked whether there was any additional proof that Elijah had posed a real threat during the traffic stop beyond the arresting officer's interpretation of his hesitation. The prosecutor glanced at his notes, then at the report, then admitted that there was no dash camera footage showing aggression, no witness statement describing threatening behavior, and no physical evidence suggesting escalation beyond confusion at the scene. It was a small answer, carefully phrased, but it changed everything. Because once stripped of tone, once stripped of labels, the case against Elijah sounded less like public safety and more like fear translated into paperwork. Judge Mercer then addressed the defense. Elijah's attorney rose and, with a steadier voice than before, argued that hesitation under pressure should not be treated as defiance by default, especially when the record showed no intention to resist, harm, or flee. She said that too many young men entered courtrooms already carrying the weight of assumptions they had no power to challenge, and that justice demanded more than reflex. It demanded care. Marcus sat with both hands folded in front of him and listened without expression, but inside him the old ache had not disappeared. It had only changed shape, because this was how it happened so often in America. Not always with shouting, not always with obvious cruelty, sometimes with forms, delays, interpretations, and the quiet willingness to believe the worst about one person while calling it caution. Rear Admiral Hale remained in the room, though he no longer stood like an interruption. He stood like witness, like conscience in uniform. Judge Mercer reviewed the file one final time, then delivered the ruling with plain, unembellished language. Based on the limited evidence, the absence of threatening conduct, and the court's concerns about the interpretation of Elijah's actions, she was dismissing the charge and ordering the record to reflect that the evidence presented did not support continued prosecution. The words were not dramatic, but Elijah closed his eyes for one brief moment, as if the sound itself had loosened something inside his chest that had been locked there for weeks. His attorney placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. In the gallery, someone exhaled audibly. Marcus did not smile. He simply lowered his gaze for a second, gratitude and exhaustion passing across his face in the same quiet wave. Then Judge Mercer was not finished. She ordered an internal review of courthouse security procedure, including witness verification, treatment standards, and the conduct that had led to Marcus's detention. She stated clearly that professionalism without fairness was not professionalism at all. Finally, she looked toward Officer Reeves. Her voice remained even, but nothing about it was soft. "Authority is not measured by how quickly you control a room," she said. "It is measured by how carefully you protect the rights of the people inside it." Reeves stood motionless, absorbing each word without defense. For the first time all morning, the room saw him not as a symbol of power, but as a man being forced to face the distance between procedure and principle. Marcus rose when the hearing ended, not because he wanted attention, but because he intended to leave with the same dignity he had entered with. Elijah turned toward him, eyes wet, voice unsteady, and whispered, "Thank you." Marcus looked at his cousin for a long moment before answering. "Do not thank me for standing beside you," he said quietly. "That is what family is supposed to do. Learn from this. Grow from it. But never let anyone teach you that your humanity depends on their approval." And in that rain-dimmed courtroom, with the benches still full and the silence finally honest, the truth settled over everyone there like something both painful and necessary. Justice had not arrived through force. It had arrived through restraint, clarity, and the refusal of one man to let humiliation speak louder than who he was. The courtroom emptied slowly, as if people understood that walking out too quickly would be its own kind of disrespect. Rain still tapped against the tall windows, soft and steady now, and the gray afternoon light had turned the polished wood a deeper shade of brown. Papers were gathered. Chairs shifted. Quiet conversations began in careful tones that sounded different from the whispers that had filled the room earlier. They were no longer the whispers of spectators waiting to see someone reduced. They were the whispers of people who had seen something undeniable and were trying to decide what it required from them after they left. Marcus Avery stood near the aisle with Elijah beside him, one hand resting lightly on his cousin's shoulder for only a second before letting it fall away. He was not a man who needed long speeches to make his point. He had already said what mattered. Elijah looked tired, but lighter too, like someone who had been carrying a stone in his chest and had finally been allowed to set it down. His public defender shook Marcus's hand with both of hers and thanked him, not only for his testimony, but for the way he had held the room together when it could have gone in a very different direction. Marcus only gave a small nod. He was not interested in praise. He had not come to be admired. He had come because too many young men stood alone when the system began to lean its full weight on them. Judge Mercer remained on the bench longer than usual, reviewing final notes, signing orders, and instructing the clerk to ensure the incident report, the procedural review request, and the dismissal record were all filed before the end of the day. There was something changed in her manner now, something quieter and more exact. Not guilt alone. Responsibility. The kind that arrives when authority is forced to look directly at its own blind spots. Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale waited near the side door until Marcus and Elijah were ready to leave. When they approached, the Admiral looked first at Elijah and extended his hand. "Young man," he said, "what happened here today does not define you. What you do next matters. Build a life that makes rooms like this answer to your character, not their assumptions." Elijah shook his hand with visible care, as though he understood he was receiving more than encouragement. He was receiving a charge. Then the Admiral turned to Marcus. For a moment, neither man said anything. Men who had lived under structure and service often understood one another best in silence. Finally, Hale spoke. "You carried yourself with honor." Marcus looked toward the rain-streaked windows before answering. Honor should not have to arrive after humiliation. The Admiral accepted the truth of that without argument. "No," he said quietly. "It should not." A few feet away, Officer Daniel Reeves stood near the council table waiting for an internal affairs representative who had already been called. He no longer looked angry. He no longer looked confident either. He looked like a man alone with the first honest mirror he had faced in years. Marcus glanced in his direction once. Not long. Not dramatically. Just long enough to acknowledge that some lessons do not come with speeches. They come with the irreversible knowledge that everyone in the room saw exactly what you chose to reveal about yourself. Then Marcus turned away. That, more than anything, was the final reversal. He refused to let the worst moment of the day become the center of his identity. As he and Elijah stepped into the courthouse hallway, the cooler air met them with the faint smell of rain and old stone. People moved around them in suits, uniforms, work boots, and church shoes, each carrying private burdens, private fears, private hopes about what the law might do when it noticed them. Marcus slowed near the entrance and looked at Elijah. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and steady. "The world will try to tell you that dignity is something you win after you prove yourself. That is a lie. You start with it. You carry it before anyone gives you permission. And when people fail to honor it, that failure belongs to them, not you." Elijah swallowed and nodded, his eyes fixed on Marcus like he wanted to remember every word for the rest of his life. Outside, the rain had eased to a thin mist. The courthouse steps were dark with water, and the American flag above the entrance hung heavy in the damp air, barely moving. Marcus paused there for one brief second, taking in the sky, the stone, the hush that follows a hard truth finally spoken aloud. He had served his country far from home, in places where danger was obvious and the stakes were clear. But this had been a different kind of test, not of survival, of restraint, not of skill, of character. And in the end, the most important thing revealed in that courtroom was not his military record, not the Admiral's apology, not even the dismissal itself. It was something simpler, sharper, and far more difficult for the world to practice. A badge does not make a man just. A title does not make a room fair. And real strength is not the power to control another person. It is the discipline to honor their humanity even when no one is forcing you to. He had once worn a uniform to protect his country. On that rainy afternoon, without raising his voice, he reminded it what protection was supposed to mean.